Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Begin Center English Zoo program. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Begin Center in Jerusalem, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our weekly Zoom event where I discuss international affairs, Israeli politics or history or Jewish issues with a guest, an expert speaker, someone from the world of academia or politics or journalism, or in this case, diplomacy. And today actually is the first in a series that we're doing, meeting with senior Israeli diplomats who have represented the state of Israel in various countries as ambassadors. And it's actually my great pleasure to have a former ambassador to my old country, the United Kingdom. Before I introduce our guest, let me just explain how this is going to work for those of you who are new to this. I'm going to have a conversation with our guest for about 30, 40 minutes. While we're talking, if questions arise, you can put those questions into the chat at the bottom of your screen. You'll see the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And once I've concluded my conversation, I will turn to your questions and put them to our guest. Okay, it's my great pleasure and privilege to have virtually with me, as it were, Ambassador Mark Regev, currently the chair of the Abba Eban Institute at Reichman University, former Prime Minister, Senior Advisor for Foreign Affairs and International Communications, and of course, as I said, former Israeli Ambassador to the United Kingdom from 2016 to 2020. And prior to that, he was the Prime Minister's Advisor and International Spokesperson from 2007 to 2016, during which you will definitely have seen him on television wherever you live, on one or other of the English-speaking channels. He was ubiquitous, representing Israel and explaining Israel's positions to the world. He's a veteran diplomat, rising through the ranks of Israel's diplomatic corps, serving as vice consul in Hong Kong, first secretary in Beijing, counselor in Washington, and prior to that, spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Jerusalem. He graduated from the University of Melbourne with a BA in Political Science and Modern History. He also has an MA in Political Science from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and a Master of Science in Management from Boston University. Ambassador Mark Regev, it's a great pleasure to have you with us.
Pleasure to be with you.
We're going to have a conversation. I'll ask you some questions. I think I've been doing this for a couple of years now, meeting with people over this Zoom and asking them questions. And this is the first time I'll be speaking to someone who is quite as well versed as you are at dealing with questions from people. I won't be as hostile as some of the people that I know you had to deal with in your time in London, but we can talk about that as well. So you served in the UK, as I said, from 2016 to 2020, which was I think a uniquely tumultuous time in Britain. You were there for the Brexit vote. There was also the small matter of Jeremy Corbyn's election as leader of the Labour Party, I think, that just preceded your arrival. So you were there practically for this whole saga of Britain's opposition party, one of Britain's two major parties, becoming this kind of breeding ground for anti-Semitism in this quite extraordinary way. Can you tell us a little bit about, because I think that's one of the most interesting things for us as Israelis and Jews, to hear about how that affected your position as ambassador, this situation of this epidemic of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party and the presence of Jeremy Corbyn as a candidate for Prime Minister, essentially.
It made my 4 years in London extremely interesting. I mean, there were two big events happening, as you said in your introductory remarks. There was Brexit, which was a significant change, and you had Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party, which was also a significant change, because Corbyn had been a member of the Labour Party for years, but that someone from the radical left of the party actually took over the leadership of the party. That had never happened before. So I was there for two unique events. I remember before taking up my post, I think I read two biographies of David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister, and he was just re-elected before I showed up in Britain, and I was sure that he would be the man I'd be dealing with in my 4 years as the ambassador in London. And then a few weeks after I showed up in London, they had the Brexit referendum, and he lost because, of course, as you know, he wanted to stay in the European Union. And then he resigned. And so I wasted my time reading those biographies of Cameron. I had to read biographies of Theresa May very quickly because she was very shortly the Prime Minister. And towards the end of my term in London, Boris took over. So in my 4 years, I had 3 prime ministers and more foreign secretaries. And so there was Brexit. And there was a whole debate, is Brexit good or bad for Israel? I mean, most British people were asking the question, is Brexit good or bad for Britain? Legitimate question. But my job as the Israeli ambassador, I was getting paid to look after Israel-UK relations. That was my job description. And so my question was, how does this affect us? And the same way I looked at the Corbyn issue, I would not have, stay out of it. Ambassadors don't get involved in the domestic politics of the country they're in. But obviously Corbyn's situation was unique, and I was very worried. I was worried that if Corbyn became Prime Minister, that all the work that we'd put in on both sides to build a strong partnership, that would be challenged.
What did you have during that period of the Corbyn leadership? Did you have a relationship with the Labour Party? Because obviously, there was still. I mean, I know from my time in the UK, there was, there's Labour Friends of Israel. There's a pro-Israel sort of movement within the Labour Party. Obviously, it was not particularly influential during the Corbyn era, but there were pro-Israel members of the Labour Party. So were you just meeting with them? Did you try and find a way to meet with the leadership? How did it work?
So first of all, from a historic point of view, the Labour Party of the United Kingdom has been a friend of the Jewish people. I was there for the Centenary of the Balfour Declaration. And we can talk about that if you're interested, because it was an interesting event. But when I learned my history, so in November 1917, the British government comes out in support of what they call Jewish Zionist aspirations for a national home for the Jewish people. What people don't know, that was a government that was headed by a Liberal Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, and Balfour was his foreign secretary. He was the Conservative. It was a national unity government at the time. But Labour was not in the government, but the trade unions and the Labour people who were at the time, they, a month before Balfour, came out with a statement saying, we support the right of the Jewish people to national self-determination in their historic homeland. Zionism was very much a part of the Labour view. And if we look in more recent history, people like Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister of Great Britain in the 60s and 70s, his immediate successor, James Callaghan, both of them friends of Israel. And more recently, the two most recent Labour Prime Minister, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, also both strong friends of Israel. And under their leadership, the relationship moved from strength to strength. And so the idea that Labour in Britain was historically anti-Zionist or hostile to Israel is just not true. On the contrary, there were friends of Israel, and there are many friends of Israel in the Labour Party. And during the Corbyn years, there were many friends of Israel in the Labour Party. I was always being invited to different events hosted by Labour Friends of Israel, meeting Labour parliamentarians. I made an effort, though, to not just meet Israel's friends in the Labour Party, but to meet the people who were more critical. I thought that's my job as well. I even had a meeting with Jeremy Corbyn at the beginning of my term. I made an effort to reach out to see if it was possible to build a dialogue. I thought that was also my job. But I suppose in the end, as more and more information came out, that people became increasingly convinced that Corbyn had a problem with Israel and had a problem with the Jewish community. And as you know, it was very interesting because for many people of my generation, you associate anti-Semitism with the racist right, with with people like the Ku Klux Klan in America and neo-fascists in Europe and so forth. And the idea that people can be on the left and be anti-Semitic is in many ways an oxymoron, because you say, well, the left believes in equality and they're against racism and they're against any sort of ethnic prejudice. But But as I studied the issue more, I mean, there is a tradition of left-wing anti-Semitism which fits into a traditional church anti-Semitism. I mean, you can take some quotes from the New Testament about Jesus throwing the money changers out of the temple, and you put all that together with a sort of a populist anti-capitalism, and you can get a socialist anti-Semitism. Marx wrote that famous essay on the Jewish question where he basically says Judaism equals capitalism, incorrectly, of course. But you have this history. The fathers of French socialism, people like Proudhon, were also, unfortunately, infected with the anti-Semitic virus. So the idea that the left is somehow immune from anti-Semitism is, of course, historically not correct.
Right. And Corbyn was certainly the most the clearest manifestation of that in Britain in recent years. Well, I think we'll return to the anti-Semitism question, but let's mention Brexit as well. So that I assume would have affected things in a couple of ways. What comes to mind for me is firstly that, as you mentioned, 3 prime ministers. So there's this kind of unusual political dysfunction in what is usually, Britain's not like Israel usually, right? Governments last a long time, they last a full term, prime ministers go on and on. And there was that unusual instability. So that I assume affected your work, but also the question of what does it mean for you as ambassador, as you said, dealing with Israel-Britain relations now that Britain is out of the EU, and you arrived with Britain being part of this bloc with which Israel had very close relations and also some differences of opinion, shall we say. So what did it mean for you in both of those senses?
So it was a challenge. First of all, people would ask me, what's Israel's opinion on Brexit? And there were many foreign governments, whether it was the American government or the French government, who told the British people what their opinion was. Maybe it was counterproductive for them to do so. But I remember President Obama came as the guest of Cameron to tell the British people, you should stay in the European Union, it's good. And the French and the other Europeans were encouraging Britain to stay. We in Israel didn't have a public position. I think also, to be frank, we weren't sure what was best for Britain and what was best for Israel. There were debates within our system. Some people would say things like, well, the European Union, the Brussels bureaucracy is intrinsically hostile to Israel. And if the European Union becomes weaker, that's good. And other people would say, well, Britain's actually a more positive voice for Israel in the European Union. And if you remove them, then it'll be more hostile or whatever. But we were unsure and we didn't have a public position, which made it for me, it was like watching a football game where I didn't have a team. I could watch and see how the debate moved forward. When Brexit did happen, though, we went into high gear in the embassy to see how does this affect Israel? Because ultimately, if Britain was changing its position in the world, if Britain was moving from being part of the European Union to an independent player on the globe, was this not opportunity for Israel? And I'll tell you, I remember my colleagues when I was in London were the ambassadors of all the other countries. And I remember going to a reception a few days after the Brexit vote. And you saw all the ambassadors of the EU countries, and they'd all walked around with his face like it was Tisha B'Av. Yes, they were in mourning because Britain had voted to leave the EU. And the EU, for many people, is not just an economic or a political relationship. It's almost religion. You know, the idea of European integration is what people firmly believe in. And that Britain had voted against this. Yes, and Britain was a significant member of the EU. It was for them a terrible, terrible thing. And they took it personally. And then I looked at the faces of ambassadors of smaller countries with growing economies, places like Singapore, South Korea, even Japan, countries that had growing economies. They said, is this an opportunity maybe for us to upgrade our relationship with the United Kingdom because Britain is going to be looking for new partners? Is there not an opportunity for us? And Israel was in that second group. I mean, we weren't out there advocating Brexit, but when Brexit happened, it was an opportunity to see if we could build a stronger partnership. And then I can tell you straight away, we had a government minister on the economic side in Britain shortly after the Brexit vote, and he was meeting with his counterpart on the British side. And the British side, they said, I remember I was even a touch surprised because I thought the British system would have been overwhelmed. Brexit just had happened. The bureaucracy would not have yet had a chance to digest its significance. But the minister said straight away, we want to do a free trade deal with Israel. We want to start negotiations now. You're a priority country for us. And the truth is, we were one of the first countries to sign a trade agreement with the United Kingdom. We did so quite quickly, basically because we didn't negotiate a new deal. We basically took the deal between Israel and the EU and we made some small changes. Very important to get the deal in place. And I think the fact that we were a priority country for Britain says something about where Israel is in the world today in the 21st century. That we're a smaller country, but our economy is very sought after. Israeli technology has a good reputation in Israel, in the United Kingdom, sorry. And I think it's, as I said, it's not by accident that they said for the British, Israel is a priority, and that's why we got the agreement so quickly.
Wow, that's really impressive. So before we leave British politics, you mentioned, of course, three prime ministers that you were dealing with. I mean, the Conservative Party, pretty much. I mean, certainly from Margaret Thatcher onwards, has been pretty firmly pro-Israel. Did anything change in the relationship because of the personalities of the prime ministers you mentioned, Cameron, then May, then Johnson?
Yeah, I think it's very important because you have many Israelis will tell you that in the Foreign Office, as you know, is very, very powerful within the Whitehall structure. And people will tell you, correctly or incorrectly, that the Foreign Office has an institutional bias which is not particularly pro-Israel. And it's the job of the political leadership to balance that. Do you remember, Paul, the series Yes, Prime Minister that was on the BBC, I think, in the 1980s?
Of course.
So there's actually one program, which I'm sure you can see on YouTube somewhere, called A Victory for Democracy, where this fictional Israeli ambassador goes into Prime Minister Jim Hacker and sort of tells him that he has to overcome the Foreign Office, yes? And they work together to overcome Foreign Office manipulations. It's quite hysterical. It was a good episode, but it does, though that was a humorous exaggeration, I saw in my own eyes a few examples where the elected leadership could overcome institutional biases within the Whitehall bureaucracy. The best example I remember is the celebration for the Centenary of the Balfour Declaration. So we're talking about 2017. And as the year dawned upon us, there was a whole campaign by the Palestinians and their supporters in the UK, and there are quite a few, who were calling on Britain, and maybe you remember this, Paul, they were calling on Britain to apologize for the Balfour Declaration. That Balfour had been a historic injustice, and just as Britain apologizes for slavery and for the opium trade and all the bad things that happened in the British Empire, so Britain should also apologize for the Balfour Declaration. And on the other side, there were people in the Jewish community in Israel and many of Israel's friends in the United Kingdom who were saying, no, we have to celebrate Balfour. Balfour is something in Britain got right. And so the bureaucracy faced these conflicting inputs, these conflicting desires. And the first, I remember when I was there, the first response, the Foreign Office minister stood up in Parliament and said, we will neither apologize nor celebrate Balfour. That was the official British position as it came up through the bureaucracy. In other words, try to balance it. They didn't want to offend the Palestinians. They didn't want to offend the Israelis. Let's try to do something down the middle. And from my point of view, as the ambassador, that wasn't good. I wanted to celebrate. I thought it should be celebrated. And the most important thing is that at the time, Theresa May was Prime Minister and Boris Johnson was the Foreign Secretary. And we worked hard. In the end, the Prime Minister at the time in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, came to London for a special meeting on the 2nd of November, on the day of the Centenary, with Theresa May. He was hosted to lunch at number 10. And that evening, there was a wonderful reception hosted by Lord Rothschild, who was, as you know, his grandfather was the recipient of the famous letter by the Balfour Declaration starts with "Dear Lord Rothschild." Yes?
Right.
And we had this event, and I have to tell you, I can't express how many people were disappointed that they couldn't be invited. There wasn't enough room for everyone who wanted to come. And a very successful event, and Mrs. May gave a speech, and Netanyahu gave a speech, and the room was full of these VIPs. So there was a celebration. And I think that was an example of maybe the political leadership saying, this is the way it's going to be.
Right.
And I think you're right. I think we've been very lucky as Israelis that you've had at the upper echelons of British politics over the last decades. You've had a series of political leaders who've consistently been well disposed towards Israel. Thatcher was a friend. Tony Blair was a friend. We go through the list. Boris, who, as we know, is going through a difficult time at the moment politically in Britain. I believe he undoubtedly sees himself as a friend of Israel.
Do you, as you mentioned, he was foreign secretary for a time during May's premiership, and then at the tail end of your time, he became prime minister. Do you? I mean, we watch this space. Who knows what's going to happen, right? He may or may not still be prime minister in the weeks to come. But do you have any? He's everyone knows he's something of a character. Do you have any stories of your own meetings with Boris, either as prime minister or foreign secretary?
So always he would tell you what a friend of Israel he is, and he would always recall that he spent 3 weeks in the 1980s as a volunteer on kibbutz Kfar HaNasi in the Upper Galilee, and he claims to have washed dishes in the communal dining room for those 3 weeks. And his detractors will tell you that's the only physical work he's ever done in his entire life. I'm not sure if that's true. I can't repeat that as a fact. I can only say that's what his detractors would say. But he would always smile and remember his time when he visited Israel as a young man. And I think he saw himself as an intrinsic friend of the state of Israel. Yes, there was something about Israel. I mean, he came as mayor of London. He came as foreign secretary. He didn't come as prime minister. That's true. I sat on meetings between him and the Israeli prime minister. I sat on meetings between him and the Israeli opposition leader. He was a big fan of Churchill, and he knew that Churchill, of course, was a Zionist too. And I think he was a friend. I can even tell you specifically politically. You know, Israeli ambassadors over the years always had a complaint against the British, maybe one of many, but this is one we can talk about, that the royal family would visit across the Middle East, yes, and they never came to Israel. And as you know, in the British system of government, the royal family won't go anywhere without the approval of the Foreign Office. That's the bottom line. And when my predecessors as ambassadors in the United Kingdom would say, well, you know, the royal family has been to Qatar and to Saudi Arabia and to the Emirates and all these countries across the Middle East and to Jordan, of course, and they have yet to come to Israel. Is it not time we're friends, we're allies, we cooperate closely? Isn't it time for a royal visit? A cynic would say the following, that they'd say, we can be good partners and friends, but without a royal visit, it's not like having a wedding ring. It's not official. You're not an official friend until it's a royal visit, yes? And my predecessors failed. Now, in 2018, when Boris was the foreign secretary and when Theresa May was prime minister, we had our first official visit by a member of the royal family. As you will recall, Prince William came. Now, it's true because Charles's grandmother is buried in Jerusalem. He came on private visits. And the late Prince Philip also came on private visits, yes? But in diplomacy, it's the official visit that you want.
Right.
And that was the first one in 2018. And the truth is, during my term, after having this period of no visits, official visits by the royal family, We had one in 18 when Prince William came, the heir of the throne, yes. And you will recall at the beginning of 2020, Prince Charles came for the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz to the Yad Vashem ceremony.
Right.
And so I believe that Boris, as foreign secretary, it's quite possible that he helped grease the wheels to make those visits possible. The fact is, they never happened before.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying there weren't other factors in play. The Israel-UK relationship has moved a lot.
Yeah.
Moved ahead, it's been upgraded, but I'm sure Boris played his part.
Okay. So just moving on to a different topic. In countries that have a large or reasonably large Jewish community and an organized Jewish community, there's always this question, I think, as to how the Israeli ambassador relates to the Jewish community, because they're not Israeli citizens in most cases. And you even have often, sometimes, a minority that are somewhat hostile. But Israel is the state of the Jewish people. These people are all potential citizens, of course. And in most countries, certainly in Britain, the mainstream Jewish community and the mainstream institutions are overwhelmingly Zionist, pro-Israel, supportive of Israel. So how did you see your role in connection? Did you come in to the job with an idea of how you would relate to the Jewish community, and did it change as you got to know them, or was it pretty sort of you kind of knew how it was going to be and that's how it was?
So I was appointed Israel's ambassador to the United Kingdom. But I was also Israel's ambassador to the British Jewish community. And I would spend a lot of time with the Jewish community. I don't think that was at the expense of my role as being the ambassador to the United Kingdom, because often it would be in the evenings or it would be on the weekends. But I think that's a crucial part of the role of any Israeli ambassador. When you've got a vibrant and diverse community, the ambassador should reach out. I made a decision when I was there that I would go, at least try to visit every synagogue in the greater London area at least once during my term. And I got pretty close to it. It was impossible. There were too many, yes. But I visited all synagogues. I thought that's an important part. Don't forget, as ambassador, you're always meeting the leadership. You're meeting the heads of the Board of Deputies and the heads of the Jewish Leadership Councils and the heads of the UJIA and the heads of the different charities, yes. But where do you meet the grassroots? You meet them when you go to a synagogue on a Saturday morning or a Sunday afternoon event. And I thought that was an important part of my job. I also think the Jewish, especially at the time, because there were all these things going on, having a good working relationship with the Jewish community helped me do my job. I can't tell you how many times, I found someone who could send a discreet message to someone high in the leadership because they'd been friends in university or something, yes? And so I saw the work I did with the Jewish community as complementing the work I did as ambassador.
Right. That's good. Yeah, that's great to hear. I mean, I think certainly, speaking as someone that was both a member of the British Jewish community and also someone who worked for a short time, for a couple of years actually at the embassy in London, I think it's really important that ambassador does that. I think I don't think all ambassadors did what you did, so much appreciated. Just to return to what we started with in a way, this question of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. So that's, I mean, even prior to Corbyn, that was something that was obviously an issue in various parts of British life, the parts of the media, university campuses, of course. Was that something you confronted? Did you have to, I'm thinking, did you have run-ins with the Guardian newspaper, for example? Did you, just trying to think of the sorts of pitfalls that could await an Israeli ambassador in London?
So I always thought it's my job to get out there and give the message.
Right.
And so I would actively go to university campuses across the United Kingdom. Sometimes there were protests against me coming. I remember when I went to SOAS, SOAS is the School of
Oriental and African
Studies. And African Studies, yes?
Yeah.
And they have a very a tradition there over the last few years of being very hostile, correct?
It's my alma mater.
Oh, well, so you know what I'm talking about.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
And I went there and they said I was the first Israeli ambassador, the first official Israeli to speak there in over a decade or something, yes? But it was important for me to go, just as it was important for me to go everywhere, because I just shouldn't just speak to Israel's natural friends. It's my job to make the case for Israel in all sorts of places.
Right.
And I was always happy to take a tough question, and I was always happy to debate. And in fact, we found what's the word? We found a format which actually took a bit of the. It was difficult for the people who were protesting against me to complain or to. I mean, they didn't like it, but instead of me just giving a speech and then they say, "Oh, well, Regev is coming to give Israeli propaganda," I'd say, find a member of faculty from the Middle East Studies Department from there and have them interview me, and they can ask me all the tough questions, like you're doing to me now, and then they open it up to the audience. And that's what we did at SOAS, and it worked quite well. It was also more interesting for me. Instead of having some stump speech that I would repeat ad infinitum, I actually got to engage, which for me was more interesting. So I went to universities in Scotland and in Wales and across England. I even went to a university or two in Northern Ireland, and I thought it was an important part of my job.
Wow.
I always said, okay, when you go to a university, it's very important. Why? Because the anti-Israel side is very, very active. And someone can spend 3-4 years doing a degree at a British campus, and if I don't go, they're never going to hear a pro-Israel voice. And that's why, at least let them have one opportunity to hear a pro-Israel voice. And so that's why I thought it was a special thing. I also thought it was important, you've got a small group of, let's say, Jewish students or pro-Israel students, and they maybe know, intrinsically that they're friends of Israel and they support Israel, but they don't know the arguments. And when I come and answer the tough questions, that helps them to understand their positions better. And even the people who are hostile or critical, or people who hate you, you probably can't do anything about that, yes, but people who are critical, if I can sort of say, well, Israelis see things a bit differently, if you can ask them to empathize a bit, they don't have to agree with you, right. But if they understand where you're coming from, maybe you've achieved something.
Right. Yeah. I think that's really important. For those in the audience who don't know SOAS, as the ambassador said, the School of Oriental and African Studies. In my time, we also knew it as the School of Antisemitism. So that tells you something about it. I think I could trace my own sort of much shorter career in Israel advocacy from my time there. So I mean, you came to the job, I think, uniquely qualified to deal with the tough questions, because of course you came to the job having been the spokesman for the state of Israel, representing the Prime Minister on the BBC and CNN and everywhere else in the world where they were interviewing people in English. Can you tell us something about that? Because I think, I remember you very well from that time. I remember seeing you on television a lot. And you were always so calm and collected. And I think you had this kind of preternatural gift of just not being flustered by, but certainly in the UK, I think some of the British interviewers are some of the toughest around. I don't know if that's your experience. That's what it looked like, at least. How do you deal with that kind of thing when you have, a prominent British journalist who is very well respected by his or her audience, saying to you, Israel's committing war crimes, Israel's doing X, Y, and Z that should be condemned by the international community? How do you remain so calm in those circumstances?
First of all, because it's your profession. And if you lose your cool, you're not going to do your job correctly, like in any business situation, right? In any professional situation. And it was my job to make the case for Israel, and it was my profession, and I'd do it as best I could. And by keeping calm is the best way to do it.
Right.
Also, often, very rarely would these people surprise me. I could guess usually what most of the questions were going to be. Sometimes they did surprise me, and then I'd try to pretend I wasn't surprised. Yeah? I'd say there are 3 ingredients to being a successful spokesman for Israel. So if anyone out there watching us tonight is thinking of speaking for Israel in the media, to be successful, I think, and I could be wrong, I think you need 3 things. First off, you have to know your stuff. You have to know your facts. You have to be an expert on the issue. Some people think, well, let's just make a list of talking points and send someone out there who's a model and looks good, right? And he or she will get the job. Well, maybe you can answer the first question, but you can't answer the second or third. You have to know your stuff backwards. And one of my advantages, because I was a spokesman at the Prime Minister's office, so I would sit in government meetings and I'd sit in cabinet meetings, and I'd know the arguments and I'd know the issues, and I'd read everything. And every time a new book came out that was relevant to my job, I'd read it, right? So you have to have knowledge, and you have to be interested, and you have to know what's going on, right? Otherwise, you can't deal with all the questions. You can maybe, but no, I don't think you can do it as effectively as if you know your stuff. Ultimately, don't forget, the journalist is asking you the question. Tomorrow, he's dealing with something in Africa, and the day after that, he's dealing with something in Asia, and the day after that, he's dealing with an American presidential election, while I'm only dealing with one issue the whole time. So I actually have an advantage over the journalist because I know my subject probably better than he does. Mm. So that's the first thing to be a successful spokesman. You have to know your issue. The second thing is, I think, and I hope this came through, but you have to believe in the essential justice of what you're talking about. I don't think I could sell Marlboro cigarettes or I don't know, some other problematic product. I actually believed in my product. Now, I'm not naive. I know the Israeli government can make mistakes. I know the Israeli army can make mistakes. I know that. But I believe in the essential justice of Israel's cause.
Right.
And when we make a mistake, so we can say we made a mistake. There's the story now about the journalist who was killed in Jenin, Abu Akleh, from a bullet. It could have been an Israeli bullet. We can't rule it out. The IDF doesn't rule it out. It could have been a mistake. But does Israel deliberately target journalists to silence the free press, as some people will mendaciously claim? Of course not. We've got a very vibrant free press. And so I think it's important. I think you have to believe in what you're saying. I think it also comes through in when you're talking to people. If you believe in the essential justice of Israel's cause, that comes across. And the third point is you have to like it. You have to like engaging with journalists. You have to like making the case for Israel, because especially when there's a crisis, like when we have one of those wars in Gaza or a Lebanon conflict or some crisis, right? So for a few weeks, you won't sleep much, and you'll be running from television studio to television studio, and it's difficult going, and it's attrition, and it's hard on you physically, and it's hard on you psychologically, because it's, you don't relax for the entire period. Now, I'm not comparing myself to the young soldiers on the border who might be getting shot at, yes, but it's a different sort of pressure. And you have to be in a situation where you're sitting, you might not have slept for the whole week more than 3 hours a night, yes, and you're sitting in the studio of the BBC, and the little red light on the camera in front of you goes on, and you know what, and suddenly you wake up because you like the job. And you suddenly, all your adrenaline's running. You have to have that as well. If you don't like talking to journalists, you shouldn't become a spokesman. You have to like the media, you have to be interested, you have to engage.
Okay.
If anyone out there watching has those 3 attributes, there's a job waiting for you.
Okay, well, you heard it from one of Israel's most veteran and effective spokespeople. So let that be important lessons for you. All right, let's get to some questions from the audience. So there's actually been a couple of questions, and I guess it's because this event is being run by the Begin Center. But there's been a couple of questions about the period in which Britain was, here in this land, very much opposed to Jewish immigration, and of course Menachem Begin was leading a revolt against the British. So a couple of questions. One of them is, I'll put them both to you because they're on similar points. One of them is, has there been a meeting between Jewish and British leaders to talk about the underground struggle in pre-state Palestine, a sort of truth and reconciliation type thing? And the second question is, do you think that people in the UK, I guess non-Jews, still view Israel in general and maybe the Israeli right in particular through a historic prism of hostility because of Menachem Begin and the Irgun?
So let's be clear, and I wrote about this recently in a column in the Jerusalem Post on the occasion of Queen Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee, that when Israel was established in May 1948, relations between Jews and Brits were not in a good place. On the contrary, there was a very hostile relationship on both sides. From the British point of view, and it's not my job to give the British point of view, but let's be fair, the Jews were ungrateful. Britain had stood alone against Hitler, had played a crucial role in defeating Nazi Germany. And the Jews had not been good allies. We'd been running around shooting British soldiers here in what was then mandatory Palestine. We were ungrateful. And we were also ungrateful of past help because Britain had originally been pro-Zionist. Balfour Declaration, we spoke about that. They'd been encouraging. So from the point of view of the British, they were angry with us. Now, we were angry back at them for very good reason. Because in the Jewish people's hour of greatest need, when Hitler was about to march across Europe, the British adopted an anti-Zionist approach. They limited the ability of Jews to come to this country, practically closing the doors of mandatory Palestine, which was in contradiction to their obligations under the mandate. They were given the mandate by the League of Nations to foster the creation of a national home for the Jewish people. And that talked about immigration and settlement and all these things that need to be done to foster the Jewish national home. And here in 1939, just as the Second World War is about to break out, just as you've got millions of Jews trapped in Europe and no one wants them, we want them here, of course, but no one else wants them. And the British closed the doors. And the British adopted an official policy that not only do they stop immigration, but there will be an Arab Palestinian state, which the Jews will be the permanent minority, just like Jews live in Iraq and Jews live in Syria. So Jews will live in a Palestinian state as a permanent minority. And this is from a people who said that they supported the right of the Jewish people to national self-determination. And from our perspective, the Jewish Underground and the Menachem Begin Center, they were people fighting for independence. So the British called them terrorists. But let's say when Menachem Begin blows up the King David Hotel, it's not like the King David Hotel today. The King David Hotel then was the military and civil center of the British mandate. It was a political military target. It wasn't a hotel where tourists were there. They targeted the infrastructure. Now, when Israel declares its independence, right, we don't get British support. On the contrary, in the famous vote in November 1947, where the United States and the Soviet Union and 2/3 of UN members support Israel's right to establish a Jewish state, yes, support our right, the British abstain. And when the Arab countries invade in May 1948 to destroy the Jewish state at birth, some of them are armed with British weapons. And one of them, the army of Transjordan, what was called then the Arab Legion, is actually commanded by British officers. And there's even a famous case of a battle, a dogfight between the pilots of the Israeli Air Force and the pilots of the RAF in January 1949 over Sinai. What happened was the Egyptians came up and attacked Israel, and the Israelis counterattacked successfully. And then General Yigal Allon, who later became an important figure in Israeli politics on the labor side, his forces went south into Sinai to outflank the Egyptians who were inside the territory of mandatory Palestine, past the international border into our side. And the British, who didn't say anything, of course, when the when the Egyptians came to our side of the frontier, the minute we went to their side of the frontier as part of our counterattack, the British launched their Spitfires from Cyprus. And there was a dogfight. Now, we won. We shot down the British planes and we won the dogfight. But the British won politically because David Ben-Gurion very rightly said, we've got enough problems fighting the Arabs. We don't need to fight the British, who were at the time a major world power. And he pulled out of Sinai. He said, okay, he told Yigal Allon, pull out straight away. But the right decision. But so you've got a situation in 1948-49, the relationship between Israel and the United Kingdom is not good. 2 years later, only in 1952, did the British recognize Israel after all the other countries, after the United States, after the Soviet Union, after most of the Europeans. The British were one of the last big countries to recognize Israel as a country. And then it still took more time to have a normal relationship. Now, your questioner asked, are these things ever discussed? I'm not sure. I mean, there are a lot of countries that were former British colonies that their leadership then made peace with the British. And I think that happened on our side too. I mean, Begin visited Britain as Prime Minister. Shamir visited, Shamir, who was the head of the more radical group, what was called the Stern Group, or the Freedom Fighters for Israel. And so they made their own peace. Why is this important today, except for obviously for the person asking the question? Because part of their campaign to delegitimize Israel today in the United Kingdom is to say that we're an illegitimate colonial creation, yes? That Israel is somehow, they talk about the Balfour Declaration, and they talk about somehow Britain has created Israel as a colonial implant.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's important to talk about the struggle for independence, about Begin, about Shamir, about the Jewish underground, to remind people that if it was up to British colonialists, we would never have had a Jewish state. We had to fight for our independence, the same as people across the developing world fought the British for their freedom. I'm reading a biography now of Nehru. The Indians didn't get their independence from Britain without a struggle, and we were the same.
Right. That's a really great point. So there's a question here from so Shmuel Yerushalmi. So he asked this question kind of earlier on while you were talking. So you kind of covered it, but I wonder if we can expand it a little bit. He asked whether, according to your impression and obviously your close knowledge now of the British-Israel relationship, whether the United Kingdom is a country that Israel can trust as a friend, as an ally. And I mean, you talked already about how successive prime ministers have been pro-Israel, but I wonder if we can sort of look at it in terms of relative to, as you said, Britain was one of the more pro-Israel, I think, countries in the EU when it was in the EU. Where does it stand? If we think of, the United States is obviously this sort of insurmountable ally of Israel, but is Britain sort of in that kind of second tier of close allies? Is the relationship a little more, sometimes a little more complicated than that? How would you define it?
So the United States is a league of its own. Yeah. And anyone who's worked, as I have, at the Israeli embassy in Washington has seen that close up.
Right.
But you're correct when you say, Paul, that the United Kingdom is very much the top of the second tier.
Okay.
And we have a very good relationship with Britain, and it's just getting better. We've got a strong trade relationship. And emblematic of that was the trade agreement that we signed shortly after Brexit. We've got a very strong security relationship. I visited an Air Force base in Northern England to see Israeli pilots train with their RAF counterparts. Now think of where we're coming. In May 1949, we're shooting at each other, and today we're training together.
Right.
There was a kosher caterer that they bought from Manchester. He was very happy because he had to provide kosher food for the Israeli Air Force people. And, all food in the IDF has to be kosher, and they were eating a lot, and they were there for quite a while, and he was providing 3 meals a day. I think the kosher caterer was very happy. But I remember going to the Israeli pilots, and I said, how is it to train with the British? And they said that it's very good because they're very good pilots, and we're learning from them. And I go to the British pilots and say, how is it to train with the Israelis? And they said, they're very good, And we're learning from it. And so both sides are gaining. So we see it in trade, we see it in business, we see it in security. I can't talk about it much, but the intelligence cooperation between our intelligence community and the British intelligence community is very, very strong.
Yeah.
And so on all sorts of objective criteria, the relationship is good. I like to put it this way. Once we were a new developing country, just, newly independent, poor, and the British were a world power. They were a superpower. And so since 1948, the British have come down a bit and Israel's gone up a bit, and we're meeting in the middle as relative equals. And that makes for a good relationship. Now, does that mean Britain votes with us the way we would like every time in the United Nations? Probably not, but they do vote better than most.
Right.
And that's something to be thankful for. And there's a good relationship. Right. Could it be better? Of course it could be. That's the job of the ambassador, to try to make it better.
Thank you very much for that response. So here's a question. This is the first question I'm asking that you may want to avoid. It's up to you. I'll let you decide. So during your time, certainly by the end of your time, there was already a lot of political division in Israel, which, the succession of elections, finally Netanyahu stepping down and being replaced by Bennett, and where we are now, and now new elections. But was that something that did that create problems for you in the sense of people in Israel, in the UK, thinking that there was, they would hear the sort of negative stuff being said about the Israeli government by the opposition, about Prime Minister Netanyahu by the opposition, which could get very heated. And was that something you had to deal with, that you were sort of having to defend, your own Prime Minister from the attacks that he was getting from other Israeli political figures?
I didn't feel that in Britain, because don't forget that Britain is a democracy, and they also have the opposition, and the job of the opposition is to attack the Prime Minister, and that's what democracy is all about.
Right.
Now, I remember when there was a time when Theresa May had a minority government.
Yes.
And she was dependent on the Northern Irish loyalists,
the
DUP, to get legislation through Parliament. And I said, this is just like Israel, right? This is, she had to sign a coalition agreement, so to speak.
Right.
And they, of course, had their demands. Were they happy? Were they following? It was very Israeli. I remember even saying once to the Prime Minister, Mrs. May, that our experience in Israel is that sometimes narrow coalitions are more stable, because it forces the members to vote the right way, because they know the government falls. That didn't help the recent, yes, but it was experienced then. It was right when I said it. And so, they know what democracy is all about. I did feel the politics more in the Jewish community, where you've got people who are more on the right, and they support parties on the right in Israel. And I met people on the left who support left parties in Israel. Yeah. And I would always say to them, you're entitled to your opinion. That's fine with me. And I would express the position of the elected government of Israel. The only thing I would say to them is that please respect that Israel's a democracy. And if the government's not doing what you want, understand that the majority of Israelis voted for that government. And you should respect the right of the Israeli people to make these decisions. If you feel so passionate about Israeli politics that you really, really, really have to say something, I said, well, ultimately, you should come here then. Make Aliyah like Mark Regev did. Come and live in Israel, make your vote, have your voice heard here. That's where it counts.
Right. Very good. Very good. Yeah, I think I once said to someone that one of the advantages I had making Aliyah was that now I can actually criticize the Israeli government and feel okay about it. Back in England, I always felt like I couldn't do that so much because I didn't want to sort of give ammunition. There's a question here from Isabel Margolin about, you mentioned that you went to Northern Ireland. She asked, how was your reception in Ireland? And I wonder if that's all she asks, just that simple question. But I think behind it is the understanding that there's certainly a lot of anti-Israel feeling, especially among Irish Republicans, I think.
Correct. The funny thing is, when you go to Northern Ireland, my assumption is, without wanting to be disparaging, is that people don't really know the Arab-Israel conflict too well. But if you are a unionist, in other words, if you are, one of the parties that believes that Britain should remain in control of Northern Ireland, you are pro-Israel. And if you're an Irish Republican who believes that Northern Ireland should be part of the Irish Republic, you are automatically very supportive of the Palestinians and the PLO. And so actually you see it in the wall murals there in Belfast, that in the murals of the Republicans, they have Palestinian flags, and in the murals of the Unionists, you see support for Israel. It's very strange. It's like that. It's actually very interesting because from a historical perspective, it's true that there was a Unionist in the government that supported the Balfour Declaration, and we've had a lot of support from people on the Unionist side. But there was also a time when the Republicans supported Zionism very, very strongly. In fact, Yitzhak Shamir, the leader of the Freedom Fighters for Israel, or what the British call the Stern Gang, his underground name, right, was Michael, after Michael Collins, the famous leader of the Irish Revolution against the British, right? The British considered him a terrorist. Well, they considered Shamir a terrorist as well, I suppose.
Yeah.
And so the point being is there's actually a history there that goes back. You'll recall we had an Israeli president, the father of the current president, who was born in Belfast,
right,
and who grew up in Dublin.
Right. Yeah. And his father, who was the chief rabbi of Israel, was the former chief rabbi of Ireland, I think.
Correct.
Right. Fascinating. Okay, so one last question before we finish. So as I said, you arrived extremely well versed in dealing with the media, of course. But there was a question here about whether Israeli ambassadors, and I guess generally, not just in the UK, get some sort of training, maybe if they don't have your experience, get some sort of training in handling hostile media. Is that part of the deal when you become an Israeli ambassador? Because there's a sort of I guess an assumption that you're going to have to deal with that, I guess, certainly if you're in certain countries.
Yes, it's part of the training. You get that training when you join the foreign ministry as a young cadet, and before you go overseas on a posting, they do that with you.
Right.
It's important, but some people, different ambassadors are good at different things. Some ambassadors are very good at pushing the economic relationship and speaking to companies and trade and investment. Other ambassadors are very good dealing with politicians behind the scenes, shaking hands, making deals, getting people to pass legislation, that good for Israel and so forth. Other ambassadors are on the cultural side. They're always promoting Israeli films and Israeli music and Israeli dance, right? Different ambassadors, everyone brings their own personality and their own interest to the job, and I tried to bring mine. I hope I did so successfully.
Okay, well, I think certainly from what I understand, everyone in the British Jewish community, which I'm familiar with, was extremely satisfied with the job that you did, and I think for everyone here, we can really appreciate what you brought to the role and what you've brought to your long career in public service on behalf of the State of Israel in various roles. So thank you for that, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's been a great start to this series. I'm gonna for those watching, listening, I've just written my email address into the chat. So if anyone isn't on my mailing list, then you can join and get more information about the events that we have coming up, or you can check out our website and our Facebook page. Next week, I'll be speaking to former Israeli ambassador to China, Matan Vilnai, and in a couple of weeks to Ambassador Michael Oren, who of course was in Washington. So once again, thank you so much, Mark Regev, for your time. And thank you everyone for joining us.